Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Quebec provincial election forecast. Now, before I begin the video, I want to just remind everyone that I am running a poll. I will be ending it around the 28th, give or take, so next Sunday. And this poll is covering Canada Federal, BC Provincial, Quebec Provincial, Nova Scotia Provincial, and I'm doing my best to try to do a Newfoundland Provincial for the ongoing Newfoundland election, but we'll see. We'll see if it actually will happen. So make sure you guys go down into the link, the pinned comment, and do the survey. And share with your friends and family. The more the merrier. Cannot have enough respondents to the poll. Now, before I begin, I'd also just shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel. And if you guys want to support the work I do here, go in the link in the description below and press that join button. Or just do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment below. But with that, let us begin. So, as I've been touching on for the last, basically the duration of this recent Quebec provincial series, you look here back all the way to December 2023, we have a small CAQ minority with a growing Parti Québécois. And this picks up in February, and then by May 24, May 24, we're starting looking like a PQ majority. And it's kind of washes around majority territory, popping around up and down a little bit. But now we're looking well into the 90-seat range, which is quite remarkable. And if you look at the popular vote trend, it is kind of the same thing. Back in December 2023, looking at a tiny popular vote, and if you go all the way to today, they're now looking at about a 14-point popular vote lead, with the opposition quite divided, though the Liberals rebounding substantially. And this is what I would describe as perhaps not necessarily the direct predictable outcome, but in hindsight, the perfectly expected outcome of the actions of the Parti Québécois in Plamondon. Now, Plamondon has been dominating Quebec's politics for the last 2 years or so because he has a very strong, very firm, very clear, but in many senses a divisive stance on the sovereignty issue. And I say divisive in that it's such a strong position. It necessarily either radicalizes people towards him or away from him. It is a wedge issue, in other words. He's adopted a very strong wedge position here. Now, this inevitably has helped him propel him to the top of the charts in Quebec and putting him in a position that he might get a majority. He might actually be able to do the referendum. And this is heavily due to, it's very clear why you would vote for Plamondon. And it's not just the one issue of the referendum. He has articulated the entire campaign so far. It's not a campaign, but his entire pitch so far has been about why you should go for the Parti Québécois as opposed to the Federalists being Liberals or even the Autonomists being the CAQ. Why those two approaches do not work and are insufficient for today. And he's been extremely successful in doing that, which is why he's at 36% here, but some polls have him as high as 38% right now, and he could very well be trending even higher than 38% if the by-election data is predictive. So he's ridden this wave and ridden this position to extreme success, and it's very, very likely, barring something crazy happening the next year, he will win. And will probably win a majority government. And if you look at the actions that Mark Carney is doing recently with the federal Liberals asking the Supreme Court to quote-unquote clarify Section 33 use, that could even further inflame issues if the Supreme Court decides to actually do something like to clarify as per the federal government. And if that clarification does in fact mean that the Supreme Court decides it can actually veto a lot of the laws like Bill 21 or other such ones in Quebec, which are very, very popular in Quebec and very widely supported across the electorate. And this would just pour gasoline on Plamondon's fire. And in that case, I think it is very likely we could see him go very high into the 40s if such an event were to happen. However, it's worth noting here that the mirror end of using such wedge issues is that it will inevitably wedge people to a different party. This is one of the reasons why you can't use the same wedge issue every single election, because eventually you will have wedged everybody. A wedge issue works once per se, maybe twice per se. And while the wedge issue, being sovereignty here, is pulling a lot of voters from both Quebec Solidaire and the CAQ to the Parti Québécois, which has allowed them to rally so strongly. It's allowing them to win in eastern Montreal again. It's allowing them to sweep rural Quebec pretty much, except for some of the eastern townships and around Quebec City, Ottawa area. But this is not a zero loss strategy. And this is, I think, part of the reason why the Liberals are starting to rebound now. Now, to benefit from the negative wedge, the negative polarization, I will call it in other circumstances, there has to be a concrete leader who at least is acceptable as a rallying point. If the Liberals have picked a bad leader, they would not be benefiting from this. And right now, Pablo Rodriguez, I think I pronounced that correctly for once, is, so far, he seems to be tracking well. And that Federalist voters seem to be content with him. And this is allowing him to start gobbling up a lot of these Federalist voters who had walked away from the Liberal Party because the Liberal Party was doing terrible for the last about 10 years. Now, the real question is, can the Liberals gobble up enough voters to actually matter here? Because you do have a certain segment of the population who are voting for the CAQ who are not Federalists. They are also not sovereigntists. They are autonomists. I think the autonomous position right now is the smallest of the three and the weakest of the three, but it's still a unique and distinct position. Now, it's very possible that if this wedging continues and this gap widens, that the polarization of the electorate could just turn this into a proper two-party system again. Now, first past post does tend towards that, so it would not be entirely surprising. However, there is reason to believe it won't do that, because if a Parti Québécois government doesn't do well, I would expect the disaffection to go into the autonomous stream and not into the Federalist stream. So, in other words, if we have this election here, and this is the result, but Plamondon's government does terrible and separation doesn't happen, I would expect him to bleed voters to the CAQ before he bleeds them to the Liberals. So in other words, while the Liberals are likely to stay as the official opposition for quite a while in Quebec, and if they can do some consolidation with the Conservative vote here, who tend to be more Federalist, they could do quite well, perhaps. Maybe even win a minority every now and then, or a majority. I would expect the party that wins the most elections will either be the CAQ or the Parti Québécois still, because these voters, about 50%, give or take, of the Parti Québécois voters and the CAQ voters are more happy to switch to the other party than they would be to switch to the Liberals or the Quebec Solidaire or the Conservatives, or to stay home. So, in the event that one party is perceived to do bad, it's more likely the voters defect to the other one, as opposed to the other three, if that makes sense. Now, with that said, there is a case to be made that the Conservatives and the Quebec Solidaire are living on borrowed time. Now, Quebec Solidaire is doing well, or has a moment of chance here, because if we look at the last election, they had about 11 seats. And they did, what, about 15% of the popular vote. So they do have a chance, and they still have time to recover, but losing Nadeau seems to have been a very big blow to the party and has really hurt the organization quite a lot. And they are losing a lot of their voters, especially in Montreal, to the resurgent Parti Québécois, and also, as a consequence, to the Liberals. As a form of negative polarization happening here, where to defeat the Parti Québécois, they are voting Liberal. So you're kind of seeing the Quebec Solidaire coalition spiral apart. Because the whole party, this entire time it's existed, has been this kind of coalition of more economically focused separatists and more economically focused federalists who are cohabitating as party because they are they're left wing on economics for the most part. But with economic issues being relegated throughout most of the world to second-tier issues, and Plamondon very, very consciously putting social issues such as immigration, such as separatism, such as assimilation and all those things very to the forefront. It's spinning out a lot of the social... It's causing the voters to split on social lenses in Quebec Solidaire. And the party is not united on that. I mean, just on the basic question, if you especially look at polls time and again, Quebec Solidaire is split almost roughly like 60-40 between Federalists and Separatists, which is not a really sustainable mix, especially when the party is allegedly separatist itself. And its leadership is separatist, allegedly. That's not a sustainable position. That's not a sustainable energy for a party. And as a consequence, when you actually put it into the test where you have a very, very strong separatist party and a very, very strong federalist party, it seems to bleed to both flanks. And if we look at the data in Montreal, they've lost nearly 10 percentage points in Montreal and another almost 10 in the suburbs of Montreal. Whereas in Quebec City and the rest of Quebec, they've only lost a little bit of ground. So almost all of the ground they've lost is in the city of Montreal and the suburbs of Montreal, where this polarization on the Federalist separatist issue is the strongest because it's the most important in that regard. There are a lot of ridings in Montreal or the suburbs that the Parti Québécois are only going to flip because Quebec Solidaire voters vote for them. There's a lot of ridings in those two regions that are going to vote Liberal only because Quebec Solidaire voters vote for them. So that puts a very strong, harsh pressure on Quebec Solidaire. It's very difficult for a party that has such an identity crisis and has a major change in leadership, losing a very popular, successful leader, for a relative new leader. And actually, I'm pretty sure Ruba Gazella is an interim leader still. I don't even think she's the full-time leader, but I could be wrong. But it makes it very difficult when you have such a leadership turnover during such a major polarizing event for your party in a first-past-the-post system. That's very, very challenging. Now, I don't think Quebec Solidaire is going to go anywhere, even if it gets down to one seat. It will still participate, and it will still exist for at least one or two more cycles. A party like this really needs to be knocked down to 0 seats for at least 2 consecutive elections to stay down. So as long as they keep seats, the party will continue to exist. But if it goes to 0 for 2 consecutive elections, I would expect the party to just die. There's just no... If you can't win seats, donors will evaporate, more or less. Especially if we still see the Federalist, Separatist dichotomy being so strongly pushed. The Conservatives as well have a similar issue, but not quite as strong. In fact, the Conservatives almost etch out an interesting niche compared to Quebec Solidaire in that the Conservatives are almost entirely Federalists, with maybe some autonomists voting for them. But they are strong around Quebec City, where the Federal Conservative Party is strong. And the Liberals right now the Quebec Liberals are doing terrible in these regions. So for a lot of these regions, if you're a Federalist voter, there's actually very little spoiler effect risk of voting for the Conservatives, because the Liberals are actually doing worse than the Conservatives in, say, Boyce or in some of the suburbs of Quebec City. They're actually doing worse there, the Liberals. So you could very well, if this situation stabilizes in the long term, start seeing like liberal-conservative coalitions in Quebec, because the Boyce here is just not competitive at all for the Liberals. It's a pipe dream now. The only way the Liberals could win these ridings again is if the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party merge, or if somehow Eric Duhaime or whoever succeeds him as leader when he eventually retires just does horrifyingly bad and the party blows up and disappears. But considering how close they were to winning a seat in the last election, and how successful they have been in some of the by-elections, even though they've lost in them, and the fact that they are very tied to the Federal Party, and the fact that social issues are a very big deal right now across the world, I don't think the Conservative Party is going to go away the same way that Quebec Solidaire is. Because Quebec Solidaire exists only for economic reasons. That's why it exists. It's an economic-focused party. But when economic issues are tertiary concerns these days, especially in Quebec, that's not a very good reason to exist. It's very hard to pitch to voters to vote for you on economic issues when you have parties like Parti Québécois, which satisfy the social issues very well and are fine in economics for like the separatist segment of the Quebec Solidaire voters. The Quebec Conservative Party, though, exists for social issues. It's not really a strong stance on federalism versus sovereignty versus autonomy, but it is strong, has a strong raison d'etre for the other social issues facing Quebec. And a lot of these are contrary to the perception of the Liberal brand. Now, whether the Quebec Liberal Party is actually socially liberal or not, I've heard people argue many things. On paper, I would say they probably are, but I've heard people argue they're not. In the same way, I've heard people argue that they're more of a moderate party, etc., on social issues. But the perception gap is large enough that I don't think it's going to be reconcilable, especially when, again, you look at Boyce area. It's already such a large gulf. If you look at the 2022 election, the Liberals did horrifyingly bad in this region. Single-digit percentages everywhere. So we're in an interesting position here. And I think, well, it's probably certain that the Parti Québécois are going to win a majority next year. The question is what it looks like. Are we going to be seeing a 5-party split with the electoral popular vote? Or is, say, the Quebec Solidaire, is it going to go down to like 4%? Is the CAQ going to disappear? Are the Parti Québécois going to surge up into the mid-40s, like the by-election suggests it could? These are the big questions on the books. And the other big question is, how will Rodriguez fare as time progresses? Right now, he kind of has the benefit of the doubt, I think, for a lot of voters. And he does seem to be channeling as the Federalist speaker, the avatar of the federalism in Quebec. But Rodriguez was never really a particularly popular federal minister. He was not particularly... He wasn't bad compared to a lot of the federal liberal ministers were, but he wasn't, completely outshining everybody. He was for the best way you can describe him as the federal Liberal minister was he was a federal Liberal minister. Not a star, not an anchor, just average, really. Maybe that'll be enough. He has some name recognition, presumably more in Quebec, but he still doesn't have the same level of charisma and energy that Plamondon has. And the Liberals are in a much trickier position because there's a lot of baked-in perception among Francophones in Quebec that the Liberals are the English party, not the Quebec party. So that really makes it difficult for the Liberal Party to do well. It's not impossible, don't get me wrong, but it is a burden. If I go to look at, say, the data here, the Quebec Liberals get just about 60% of the Anglophone vote and 13% of the Francophone vote. That's a really tough pill to deal with. It's not impossible by any means, but there's only so much they can do by consolidating the Anglo vote more. Now, it will help them marginally to gain more with the Anglo vote. A lot of ridings in Montreal and the suburbs of Montreal are accessible there, and parts of like the Eastern Townships over here are accessible by doing that. But to actually win an election, they need to do significantly better with the Francophone vote. And thus far, it doesn't really seem like the Liberals have a game plan to win the Francophone vote, or at least gain more of it. So far, it really seems like they're kind of hoping that the other parties disintegrate and they can benefit by gobbling up a larger percentage of those voters than they lose. Then go to the Parti Québécois. And that could happen. For example, you could say maybe, let's say half, or let's say all of the Quebec Solidaire and Conservative voters would go to Liberal. Then they only need to get a little less than half of the CAQ voters to go Liberal if it went down to fully two parties, and then have a majority. But it's dubious that would actually happen. Especially because, again, you look at the remaining people who are voting Quebec Solidaire, and they're overwhelmingly French. You look at the people who are voting CAQ, and they're overwhelmingly French. The majority of them are French. So it seems unlikely to me that you're going to have the Liberals are able to pick up a lot of these voters without a change in platform and a change in direction. And maybe it was possible, or could still be possible, for the Liberals to do this. But they are heavily hurt by their association with the Federal Liberal Party. Or hamstrung by it, I should say. Especially if the Federal Liberal Party does things such as kill Bill 21, which is very popular among Francophones in Quebec. If they get the Supreme Court to come up with some interpretation of Section 33 that lets them overturn Bill 21, I don't see a possible way for the Liberals to ever win again. At least not in a meaningful time period. That would be a huge transgression to a lot of voters. The Federal Liberal Party basically just vetoed a law in Quebec contrary to what everyone interprets the Constitution to mean. That would be a really big deal. Now, it could turn out that the Federal Liberal request fuzzles out and nothing happens with it, or maybe the Supreme Court has an ounce of wisdom and decides not to do anything and leave the Section 33 as it has been understood since time immemorial, being 1982. In which case, the Liberals do have at least an avenue to win. They do have things that they could argue. Some paths could be they could try to push on the uncertainty in foreign interference of becoming independent in the current foreign the geopolitical situation right now. They could point to Trump. That worked for Carney in Quebec, so it could work for Rodriguez. They could point to all sorts of different things as well about the uncertainties and the difficulties of independence, the benefits of staying in Canada. But the key here is they can say and point to all of these issues. But voters do have a bias to action, even if the action involved is actually bad. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, the Quebec Liberals are correct on everything regarding independence and separatism. They are correct on all fronts. In that case, it's still possible. People will still vote for the Parti Québécois in a referendum and say yes on the referendum because they have a bias to action, and the Liberals haven't provided a satisfactory answer to the issue at hand. Because underlying the Federalist versus Separatist debate that is resurging in 2025, this is not the same version of the debate that was happening in the 90s or the 80s. This is about the reflection and understanding among Francophone nationalists in Quebec that with the current immigration system, the current government system, the current laws in Canada, there is no good way to continue to preserve the Francophone identity of Quebec. That is the core thesis of Plamondon. It's not just we should be independent because we're different. That is part of it, but the core essence of his pitch is that Quebec cannot maintain itself, its own culture, in Canada. It's not possible. Which again is why the Supreme Court going in and saying, actually, we can overturn Bill 21 or other such legislation. There's several more pieces. It's not just Bill 21. That would be so catastrophic for the Federalist side, because that would be confirming all of the things that the separatists have been saying for 50 years. That we cannot keep our identity in Canada. If Quebecers cannot vote for a government to do a law that they want to preserve their own culture, then there's really no argument that you can keep your identity in Canada if you can't make laws to protect your identity in Canada. That's really the big issue at play here. Now, the Federalist side, the way to diffuse this is they would really have to try to harp on the mechanisms and the goals and the plans that they have to keep this mechanism, to keep protecting the identity of the Quebecois while staying within inside a united Canada. In that regard, I think the only rational and only correct position the Quebec Liberals could play is they basically have to outflank Plamondon on immigration. That does come with a big risk that a lot of their voters in Montreal are immigrants. But they really have to be staking a claim or taking the gamble that either they defect to Quebec Solidaire, a lot of these immigrant voters, or the Conservatives or something. They're more likely to stay liberal than defect. And the only way they can gain ground in the rest of Quebec is to really do something bold like this. If Rodriguez just stays status quo, or he just decides to do a limp-wristed campaign, or really just critique separatism, that's a failed campaign. That will be a losing election and probably a losing referendum vote. The only way I see a path forward, at least for the Liberal Party, or the Conservative Party, for that matter, is you have to outflank Plamondon on issues related to identity. The identity of Quebecers. Can we preserve the Quebec nation inside a united Canada? That should be the question all Federalists are asking themselves. How do we protect the uniqueness and the culture of Quebec while staying inside a united Canada? What can we do? What mechanisms are there? What tools can we use? What policies can we push? If you are not answering those questions to yourself and you are a Federalist leader in Quebec, you should ask them yourselves. If you have no ideas on how to do those, you should resign and give your job to someone else. Because there is only one path to defusing the separatists in Quebec, and that path is you have to address their concerns. And this is true with every issue across the country. Across every issue. If people are upset about something and they are doing something, it's there for a reason. We have to reflect as Canadians. And sorry, this is getting a bit more political in the sense that this is not so much observation, this is more soapbox, but whatever. It's fine. Voters have real issues. They have real concerns. You can't just look at them and ignore them. If you are just going to pretend their concern is wrong or that their ideas are bad so we don't need to do anything about it, you are going to lose. You are going to lose. Voters have an action bias. They want something to happen. If people in Quebec are scared that the Quebec culture is going to get eroded away because of immigration, because federal government is intervening and doing things, because federal laws are overriding Quebec laws, etc., because the internet is assimilating people, because of all this other stuff. These are reasonable and valid concerns. If you say to these people who have these reasonable and valid concerns that there is no solution inside federalism, do not be surprised when they become separatists. If there is no solution inside Canada, the only solution is to leave Canada. This is basic math. This is not rocket science. There is no way to get people to stay inside your country unless you use naked force if they think staying in your country is bad for them. The only way you can get them to stay in is by telling them and convincing them that actually it's not bad for them. And this isn't the 90s. This isn't the 80s. This isn't the 2000s anymore. Economics are not the main driving issue here. It is social issues. Everything, especially since the pandemic, but in my adult life, basically the last 10 years, everything has revolved around social issues, particularly immigration. There is no path for the Liberal Party in Quebec unless they answer this question of identity. How do you protect the identity of Quebecers inside a united Canada? If the Liberals cannot answer that question, the Conservatives cannot answer that question, to a lesser extent, if the CAQ cannot answer that question, the Parti Québécois will win and they will pass a majority. They will get a majority government, they will get a referendum, and the referendum will vote yes. That is the inevitable and predictable consequence if the rest of the parties have no answer to this. And I will add here, this is part of the reason why Quebec Solidaire is dying as well. Quebec Solidaire's premise as a party is that it's separatist, but it's very socialist, but it's also socially left-wing. And that's one of the reasons why it is struggling. Again, the separatist identity issue is a high-level issue, the high-level polarization, but on the low level, to the Francophone nationalists who want separatism, who's scared about losing the identity of the Quebec nation, saying that you're going to get independence to have more multiculturalism is a bit of a poison pill. It worked when the leader, to a certain extent, was very charismatic, or when the Parti Québécois was run by limp-wristed leadership. But when Plamondon has a strong platform and a strong leadership, and Quebec Solidaire lost their charismatic leader, it becomes a very hard thing to sell people because it doesn't really make any sense. It's kind of an incoherent position to want separatism just to be more liberal than Canada. That's I'm paraphrasing a little bit, so all their platforms, but it is a very hard position to sell people. And when social issues become even more important, there's just nowhere for that to go. It's very difficult for that platform to work. And that's really what's going on in Quebec right now. It's a microcosm of every other problem in every other society in the West. We have some leaders who are smart enough and adaptable enough to realize that social issues are the most important and we need to tackle them. And you have a lot of leaders who still think this is the 90s and economics are the thing that matters. They're not. No one voting for Quebec sovereignty right now is doing it because they think it's good for the economy. They're doing it because they think it's the only way to protect Quebec's culture. To them, saying the old 1990s Federalist argument of Quebec will be poor is irrelevant to a lot of these voters saying, hey, you'll be poor, but you'll have your own culture and be able to make your own laws and have your own self-determination. It's like, okay, fine. So many of them would say yes. In fact, all the ones I know would say yes. And I've talked to many Quebec separatists in my life. So that's not a compelling argument. You have to address their underlying concerns. You have to convince them. No, you have to show them they can actually get what they want inside Canada. Does that mean Quebec will end up having to have probably more autonomy if the Federalist side wants to win? Yes. It probably does. Does that mean the rest of Canada will have to accept that Quebec's going to have laws like Bill 21 or other such laws? Yes. Does that mean Canada's going to have at least Quebec specifically, but probably all of Canada, because complexities of freedom of movement inside the country, we'll have to have less immigration? Yeah, probably. But that's the price Canada has to agree with. Price is the wrong way to phrase this. That's the necessary changes Canada has to agree to ward off separatism. If the Federalist movement in Quebec doesn't do this, doesn't make this argument, doesn't show, and it's not sufficient to say, hey, look, you can do this. You have to show voters. You have to prove it to them. Words are meaningless. But unfortunately, a lot of the leaders of the Federalist movement are partisan federal liberal voters. Not all of them, but many of them. And the federal liberals, to them, federalism means centralization. And that's going to be very hard to sell, especially with Carney asking to try to neuter Section 33. But with that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I will see you next time with something else.